I'm excited about this because, you know, where I'm from on Cape Cod, there was a Marconi site as well. You know, I've been there a million times. Beautiful beach. Oh, by the way, I'm with the Jersey History Hunters.
Oh, by the way.
Yeah, by the way. So
Awesome,
don't forget to check them out. ChiggsArmy hat on. I'm gonna have one of the shirts on before it's over.
And this is a fun thing. You are in an artifact. This was a temporary set of 4 buildings built to last 5 years, the expected duration of the war. And because Camp Evans was always going to be closed after World War II, but some stuff kept coming up. Korea came up, then Vietnam, and they always seemed to need a place for their blacklist projects. So they always just maintained this site. So in 1993, when they said, okay, we have to shrink down Fort Monmouth and its development work, so they said, let's get rid of Camp Evans and turn it over to the civilians for development. It was this time capsule of a World War II and Cold War development laboratory laid over top of a Marconi World War I wireless station. So you had the Marconi Corporation here, the RCA Corporation here, the U.S. Navy Corporation here, the Marines during World War I. Then during World War II, you had the Army and the Army Air Corps here. Every branch of the service has ties to this place. And the British government seizes the 2 stations in Wales, so this has no one to talk to. So it becomes an experimental technology development thing, but it also gets embroiled because the Germans were worried that the British were using this facility and sending secret coded messages to their fleet because there were no sensors here.
Yeah, can you imagine carrying that thing around in the field, metal detecting, huh? It's like a video.
All that is in here.
Early black and white television. What is a television? It's a complex of radios. One sends voice, just like a radio, or music, sound is the right word, and the other one sends dots. And because of our poor eyesight of, you know, not being able to quickly determine things changing, as the dots are shot across the screen, we see an image where it's really just changing of black and white dots. Okay, so 2 radios, one for voice, one for dots. What's color television? 3 dots, the primary colors. So your eye blends them and you see other colors than the primary. And what's high definition? More smaller dots.
This piece is an anchor for that tower? Is that what that is?
It's for the guy wires that held up. Here's
You found any yet of those? No, not yet.
yeah, that really makes the thing.
It would.
Sing.
Yeah.
I like finding the radio.
Beautiful.
And so you're approximately here now, and this was the line of towers.
Oh, wow.
And here was where the wire from the towers went, and that's where the equipment was. Jukebox. And look at this fun thing. The only time kids today can enjoy that is if their parents or grandparents take them at a nostalgia restaurant.
Yeah.
Now here's one that frustrates me to no end. This is Tektronix oscilloscope. The maker of this company, the guy who created this company from scratch, he worked here during World War II. He was working on a project, and Bill Hewlett, the H of HP, was sent here for special projects in electronics during the war, you know, on and off. He wasn't assigned here, but he was here. And he went to this guy and he said, hey, why don't you come and build better oscilloscopes for HP? Because they were already building oscilloscopes. And the guy goes, you know, I'm going to go back home to Oregon, and I got some ideas. And I'm going to make a company so my friends and family have work, right? And he did, right?
Ooh.
And so that's an $8 billion company called Tektronix.
Yes, he was the founder.
Yes, and
So that,
and how he got his cutting edge thing that went into his first project was when our troops would go into a field of battle or a captured area, they would find any enemy electronics, bring it back here and analyze it. And there was advanced techniques in the German oscilloscopes. And so that's what he put into his product.
So this is all like hands-on stuff
Yep.
where you can learn about it. And,
Yeah.
In dem Deutschen Museum.
Yeah, oh, I don't blame you. And so we want to expand this. And not only do we hope to one day get a wonderful grant to expand this, but we would like to have it so, as a former science teacher, there were times where if I could do a cutting information breakthrough idea, but you didn't have the equipment, and if you put the equipment together, when you were done, you had nowhere to store it. So you know how they have lending libraries for books? If we could create science kits that we could lend out to science classes and bring them here when they're done, what a wonderful thing.
Yes.
Okay? Because as we say, what is the best way to honor people who did cutting edge science work and application of science to communications, but to preserve their laboratory and use it for education? Okay. And to show people how old time radios were fixed up and TVs, when you can actually see the components like the resistors, transistors have replaced the vacuum tubes, but you can open up your iPhone now and there's nothing you can fix. Well, this shows what discrete components were like.
Right.
So this is like a living exhibit. And
what are the flags?
there-
the semaphore.
yeah, after an area is bombed out, there's no communication, no telephone system, et cetera, if it existed like a Pacific Island. And they have all this portable equipment designed, including power stations and generators and things like that, to go in and set up communications. Okay, and that's it. And the Army Navy vacuum tube standardization facility was here because, you know, everybody's patriotic during a war, but there's money to be made, and every tube radio manufacturer who the Army would subcontract to make things, they'd go, oh, you can only use RCA tubes in our equipment. And the sample equipment would be brought to a building back here, and they'd take it apart and analyze it and go and say, no, if you want this contract for 10,000 of these jammers or whatever, you redesign it with Army standard tube this number, because it'll work in your system. And that's what they did, because you couldn't have a repairman needing 100 different tubes to repair something in the field. These kind of things where some of these vacuum tubes would go out in, you know, maybe 2 or 3 days of use. Remember the walkie-talkie? You walked and it was on your back.
That is.
Walk and talk.
Yep.
Wow.
And then they came up with the handy-talkie, okay, which was a miracle of miniaturization.
Wow.
The computer industry did not write the first techniques of how to miniaturize. It was the Army Signal Corps on how to miniaturize radios. And the goal was to get the radio in your helmet, and they did. Tank radios, field radios. Radios were very, very important, but the bulk of communication went across wires, and there were guys whose job was to spool wire out so these phones could talk. And the legendary Pacific code talkers, they talked on wires, okay? And in Europe, when Patton made his breakout, he actually had to slow down because he was beyond the usage of field wire, so that they actually had to get teams together, get used wire that had been run over by tanks, splice it together, re-spool it until they could get it.
I never heard that.
Oh yeah, that's one of the realities of war. You, as a general, you have to have your staff predict your material needs. And in this case, he outperformed their predictions. Here's the thing where they figured out how to jam the German Würzburg radars, and I told you that story with Alan B. Dumont and bringing back the parts here and figuring out how to jam it. The Germans had set up 2 beams that would guide them to bomb London and areas in England at night, and they figured out how to move the beams. And it was a cooperative message. The British service would set up piles of wood and stuff like that, so that when the Germans bombed farm fields, they would ignite fires so it would look like a city was burning.
Wasn't there some like moral dilemma though, because they were telling the Germans where, there could be farmers and,
Right.
yeah, I
it was
remember
a
reading
tough
about that.
call. This is a whole tour itself. The professional organization that takes care of this and created it is called the Association of Old Crows. Heat-seeking missiles, they developed a system here, and this is an empty one without the secret stuff inside, that is underneath the president's helicopter, and if somebody pops out of an area and shoots a heat-seeking missile at a helicopter with this on it, it actually causes it to spin out of control and blow up, just like in the James Bond movies. Because this started here, the team sent us one as a gift. Okay. The cool thing about this Bastogne model is that when Bastogne was surrounded, they were running out of supplies. Able to get supplies in, they had volunteer 101st Airborne paratroopers drop into the city with a electronic beacon that cargo planes with the right equipment could drop the supplies in the city. And last time I was at the National Archives, I actually found a photograph with documentation of testing that beacon right in this field here, because it was like, we got to get this done now. We don't have time to go out to a test range. Let's do it right here. And so that made the difference. When General Patton broke through into Bastogne, he went to the American General Mikhailov and said, "We've saved you," right? Mikhailov goes, "You didn't save us. As long as we had stuff dropping out of the sky, we were fine." The roots of that are here. You know how before D-Day, this is a secret thing. It was secret one time. It was called Glimmer and Taxable. And before D-Day, they sent planes with specialized equipment up and down the French coast to ferret out where the Germans had radar equipment and what frequency they were using. And they mapped that all out, and they did two things with that information. One was where to attempt to destroy the radars, where they wanted to leave radars intact, and where they wanted to jam radars if they couldn't destroy them. Now you're saying, well, why would they want to leave radars? Okay. Well, they had done a whole coordinated misinformation thing that said, and they even had like General Patton, who was supposedly going to lead the invasion from a misinformation campaign, go into British bars and talk about how the landing was going to be faked in Normandy. So they did this whole information campaign, but the Germans weren't worried because they had the unblinking eye of radar. So their radar was cross-covering the whole French coast, and they didn't have to worry, right? But here's what the British and Americans did. They had radar spoofers that on fishing boats, this equipment would detect German radar waves and would multiply them and send them back. So off of the area of France where the landing was led to be believed, there was a larger fleet of ships and planes approaching that coast. I want to say Calais maybe. And then was in Normandy. And that nobody knew which way to go. So that was part of the reason that the counterattack to move the Panzer tanks with Rommel to kill the landing on the beach was delayed. This is how our method worked. When we started this, there were just a couple of guys with an idea. So we didn't have a large organization. So we invited existing organizations. One was the New Jersey Antique Radio Club, which you saw their museum. Another was the New Jersey Historical Divers Association. They started with a table in our first building, then one room in the Marconi Hotel, and now they have 5 rooms here. Before Marconi's wireless came, going across the Atlantic was very risky, and thousands of people died every year in ship accidents. The New Jersey coast is littered with over 5,000 shipwrecks that they know of, right? So these are some artifacts of them. There's our hero Marconi, and there's the Titanic, and like a lot of these ships you can dive on, and it's really cool. And every shipwreck is a time capsule of when it went down. And what survives, it doesn't decay, tells you about technology and life at that time. One of the known major shipwrecks was the Andrea Doria. This is an artifact from the Andrea Doria.
What is it?
It's the gyro pilot.
Yeah.
And now here's one. I used to dive, and because of diving, I researched the shipwrecks that I would dive on in archives. I kept running into these stories about this guy Marconi and how his wireless was saving lives by being able to tell people, hey, we're going down, right? Well, this writer named Dr. Harold Zoll, his writings were in a lot of the archives because he told these stories about how, oh, by the way, our World War II radar laboratory was built on top of a Marconi station. And when we did our initial radar demos, we put our equipment on the same spot as Marconi's 1899 first demo of wireless. So accidentally, I got a background in here. I had the background to say, no, don't demolish this. We don't need another industrial park. When you would have a mill, you would have your grindstones, and they didn't have Home Depots then. So you would contract for a company to bring in grindstones, and what happened is the ship went down, its grindstones are laying on the bottom like Oreo cookies spilled out of a box. And then a few years later, an early generation single hull metal ship lost its boiler in a storm and hit the grindstones and sank on top.
So shipwreck on a shipwreck.
Yep, one swim from the beach, 2 shipwrecks.
This restroom is in the style of something you see during World War II.
Yeah, when you're doing historic preservation, you try to use materials, the same materials or like materials. And so these stalls, some of them are original, but you'll notice this stall, like if a World War II guy came back, he'd go, why does this one have a big door?
Yeah, okay.
Right, so
you had to make it wheelchair accessible.
yeah, and thanks to a kind architect, it meets all the requirements. What are the preservation guidelines? And these are original urinals. That was the power station for this facility. And during a very cold winter in, I think, 1917, they were running out of coal because of the Pennsylvania Railroad strike. They sent the Marines out to cut down trees, and they realized that they couldn't keep up with the boiler in there. So they actually went down and commandeered coal from the local Asbury Park school system, and the school system had to close down, right?
Whoa.
And then the follow-on was then they did free up some coal to be delivered to the local Belmar train siding, and when they went down to pick it up, the train yard master said, hey, your paper isn't right. I'm not releasing this to you. And the crew came back and they told the commander here, and the guy goes, hey, this is wartime. We're in charge of the railroad. He called him up and said, no, you don't understand. You're releasing that coal. And then he sent a contingent of armed Marines with the crew to sort of make sure they understood they were serious. So they got their coal, okay? And a cool thing that I didn't tell you is the team that formed here during World War I of wireless experts, they were championed because they were told to break up after the war. Thomas Edison championed the creation of a permanent wireless development facility in the Navy. It didn't land in New Jersey. It ended up outside of Washington, D.C. It's called the Naval Research Laboratory. And over 60% of the opening day staff were people from here. And they developed radar. So the fathers of Army and Navy radar are associated with this facility. And like I told you, after the war, they brought the German radar experts here. So this is a special place in radar history. The radar here was great. It would tell you the enemy's coming, okay, at 150 miles, and you could scramble things. And actually on Pearl Harbor, the radar that spotted the Japanese approaching were radar developed by the team here, and 8 of them were deployed around Pearl Harbor. And one of them actually spotted the planes approaching. They called it in, but the Navy had not trained anyone in the control center. So the building guard, there was no staff on that Sunday, picked up the phone and said, there's some B-17s coming in from San Francisco. You know, in his head, he's thinking this. It must be them. Don't worry about it. It must be our guys. Click. Warning was missed by 50 minutes. And after that, no radar message would be ignored. But when they realized what had happened here, because the guys here were dying, and this is written up in a published paper, they're like, we had worked years to prevent a surprise attack. And our first 2 radars were put on either end of the Panama Canal, and then the next 8 were put in Pearl Harbor, and they got through anyway, right? So then the message came back that the radar had worked, they had spotted, it was like, yay! And so then they realized, well, they could go for the Panama Canal. So they actually brought in Army ships. The Army does have ships, and they mounted radar on the decks and sailed them down to the Panama Canal, and they did double layer picket duty, so that way they not only had the 150 miles of the land-based radar, but then they had another layer to detect any unidentified warship coming towards the Panama Canal. There's a book about radar in 13 nations. The main players in radar came up with something you could call radar in the same 3-month period. Wow. So all the underlying inventions sort of popped at the same time, because they knew microwaves could cook things, but radars and those things cost big money. And so it wasn't until many years later, the 1950s, that they came out with radar ranges, and only like the railroads could afford them, because they ran like $5,000 in their period of time. They knew you could cook things with radar. And when they brought the press up there at the end of the war to demonstrate this radar, the old-fashioned press cameras, you'd put this flash tube that had like a metal Brillo thing with magnesium and other things in it, and they'd set an electric charge, and that would ignite and send out a flash, and you'd keep your spare ones in your pockets. So when they bring them up and they turn on the microwave radar, it gave off so much energy that it lit off the bulbs in their pockets. So it was so exciting. Cool. Their pants caught fire. The site is publicly famous for a couple of things. The first one is they had a World War II antenna over there, Project Diana. They took a World War II radar antenna, 150 feet tall, bounced the first signal off the moon that proved that you could get radio and radar waves through the ionosphere. That was Project Diana. They took a captured Würzburg Riese, a German experimental radar that was used in the protection of German-held France, and they brought one of the units here, they rebuilt it, and that was here to spot our first satellite launch called Vanguard, but the Soviets beat us to the punch. Whether we let them or not, that's one of the things that the people here who are developing part of the satellite package were told to slow down, and they believe they were told to slow down so the Soviets could win. I don't know if that's true. But then they built another dish here, and supposedly that was to track Soviet missile launches, because this is original name. It was built in 1958. It was called the Silent Sentinel, to look for enemy launches. And supposedly with that and the other 50-foot dish, they were trying to find missile launches from the Soviet Union.
Well, that was an amazing tour. I had no idea it was going to be something this involved, you know, coming up here and seeing the museum, and it's just absolutely amazing. I wish I had like 20 hours to really look at that and listen. I mean, this guy is incredible. If you're ever in this neck of the woods, this is a place you got to stop and see. The history here is just absolutely, I'm blown away. I really am.
My big round baby, and I'll rock you until I go to sleep. She'll shake the coins from your pocket, take your gold chain and your locket. Mother Earth has no sympathy.